reader into the setting in which the action unfolds. His is a survey in Mayhew's sense of the term, in which a social landscape is entered into and personally observed for complex patterns of living and distinctive social worlds. Okay, so the authors highlight the distinction between the first and second half of Tearoom Trade, just as I have, emphasizing the practical value of the descriptive minimalism of the first part. They write, the thinness of Tearoom participants' conduct as compared with their otherwise highly variegated lives ensconced at considerable distance from the park setting makes their deviant status, not their urban anonymity, a fact blown way out of proportion. Humphreys felt justified in offering the following public policy recommendation in order to alleviate the damaging side effects of covert homosexual activity in tea rooms. Ease up on it. Okay, and I basically want to argue that this method itself is a way of kind of easing up on research subjects. By presenting the participants in the games of sexual exchange as mere players, Humphrey thins out the account of deviance, effectively voiding the subjectivity of these deviants, otherwise overly legible as homosexuals, closet cases, sex addicts, you fill in the blank. The suggestion is that once one is caught in the crosshairs of a thick psychological account of the subject, everything is permitted. This type of speculation is excluded in the natural history of the tea room, resulting in a different account of subjectivity, a different ethics, even a different set of policy recommendations. Of course, one might argue through a biographical lens that it was Humphrey's later self-identification as a gay man that also came down the pipe. That was the reason for his sympathetic attitude toward the men and the activities they observed in the restrooms in these public parks. But I think the lesson of Tearoom Trade and its ultimate value for sexuality studies is that the politics is in the method, not the attitude. Humphrey's book shows the promise of Goffman's descriptive, observational approach. In his attention to visible behavior, his pursuit of a stripped and cramped psychology, and in his precise accounting of the dynamics of everyday life, Goffman allows us to focus on the interactional and social parameters of sexuality, not the desires of the actors. In such a framework, both sympathy and censure are beside the point. Okay, I have a very small, very brief coda here, and I just want to kind of emphasize why I think that this, what might seem like really like dated versions of social sexuality studies, or just research in general, might be relevant today. I think there is some interest in the history of the social sciences, and in particular in dramaturgical theories of the self. Other people are tracing that connection or that misconnection. But I don't see deviant studies or microsociology in particular catching fire right now. But I do think these are useful tools as we try to understand the peculiar circumstances of the present. In the contemporary moment, the system of sexual stratification, like Gail Rubin's Charmed Circle, with which we have been familiar, is in flux. New civic inclusions and a mainstream gay and lesbian platform of patriotism, parenting, and prosperity have made it difficult to know whether what have long been known as minority sexualities and genders are permanently linked to stigma. The changing context and significance of LGBT identities has meant that single-issue politics around sexuality can be more easily appropriated in service of domination. So we can think about the fact that multinational corporations like Lockheed Martin, Goldman Sachs have led the way in providing benefits to gay, lesbian, and transgender employees. We can think about the kind of critiques of hate crime legislation and neighborhood policing initiatives for creating safe space for gays and lesbians and the other kinds of exclusions they produce. Think about the linking of secularism, anti-immigrant sentiment, and anti-homophobia and Dutch citizenship tests, right? These are all very troubling examples. And I think some contemporary scholars in the field have responded to this situation by turning their attention away from sexuality and sexual identity and sexual communities altogether, instead focusing on things like the legacies of liberalism, racialization, or privatization as more productive and critical sites to engage sexuality as a structuring force in modernity. Stigma and deviance may indeed seem like outmoded concepts in the contemporary moment of, on the one hand, widespread but uneven gay assimilation and acceptance, and on the other hand, sweeping critiques of homonormativity. However, I want to argue that despite the uses to which a singular focus on homophobia can be put in this new climate, and there's no doubt that that is true and can be quite damaging, attention to the specific dynamics of sexual and gender stigma is still important. The history of gay liberationist, transgender, and queer political thought demonstrates the potency of stigma as an optic for making visible ongoing dynamics of inequality and exclusion. So the framework of homonormativity, right, critiques of homonormativity, is very good at capturing these new forms of complicity, but I think it can block from view ongoing, everyday forms of violence. By focusing on the microdynamics of social marginalization, it's possible, I think, to be more specific about the processes of normalization that shape contemporary gay and lesbian life and how they fail. Deviance studies focus on highly particular figures can help us to make sense of what is really an uneven landscape, and I hope revitalize models of collectivity based on shared marginality. That's the original promise of queer. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure you will take questions.
I will take questions.
Who wants to start? Well, I'll start just by asking a simple thing. Do you see deviant as ever have a chance of becoming the new queer? You know, that we can all say, we're deviants, or, you know, we're deviants and we're here. I mean...
I'm into it. I think that actually did have a kind of moment around sort of, Jonathan Dollemore, Sexual Deviance, like 1990, 91, right in that kind of moment.
Exactly the moment with Butler's.
Same
rise
moment.
to the top. Yeah.
Same moment, And I think, and again, I was thinking about this today. I was like, really, in a way, it's not. Some of these points that I'm making, they're not really big news. That there is a lot of continuity between like social science research on deviant studies and like canonical queer theory. Ask Gail Rubin, she's not confused about that at all. Lots of people working in the social sciences right now would just say, yeah, that's an obvious connection. But it's what I'm interested in is the kind of, both productive and limiting force of these kind of disciplinary formations, which, again, this would be sort of part of the sort of like why we need to think about queer method, which is basically, extremely visible to people in the social sciences who are kind of suffering from it because they're not being cited or read, and invisible to people in queer theory who are stand to gain from a disavowal of those disciplinary differences, right? It's like people who are gaining from it are like, what are you talking about? I don't have a method, I don't have a discipline, right? Whereas their disciplinary formation is completely obvious to people who are kind of on the other side of it. So I'm interested in the way that this disciplinary formation has blocked this from view for people who, with my exact training, basically. And so I think, it's not like it's particularly important that I say this, but I think it's important that somebody who is a literary studies scholar does say it, because it's been said a lot by people who don't have this formation and ignore it. So, again, I think I don't think deviance, or the idea of the deviant, like comes as a surprise to people who've been working with these materials for a long time, and do teach Laud Humphreys every year and see that as kind of canonical, and feel like whatever, Sidney Patton said to me recently, I think everything took a really wrong turn with gender pejorativity, and I tried to tell Butler that at the time, right? And I mean, whatever. This is not news to a lot of people who've been thinking about this, but I think it is news to us. I mean, I guess I like the term deviant. I'm interested in it. I'm interested in this.
I like it.
I like it too. And it's kind of kinky or whatever. But then I really, this project on stigma is really trying to think about stigma as a term that could potentially do the kind of work that queer has failed to do. Because queer tries to have this kind of universalizing force to it, like all different forms of marginality, but it's so clearly linked to sexuality that it's that the Kathy Cohen critique about, well, this claims to be about everybody, it's really just about gay people, I think it can't help sort of reproducing itself. So I sort of feel like stigma, for all of its problems, as a kind of universalizing category, and there's plenty of problems in the Goffman text, maybe would be an interesting way to try to revitalize that model of shared stigma, kind of outside, sort of, collectivity of the shamed, everybody around the margins, which, again, we've sort of gone in the other direction now toward critiques of the politics of analogy, critiques of comparison, keep it local, keep it specific. But I think this is the basis for coalitional politics. I still believe in that, and I think we need to kind of like keep working those arguments about, we basically need an account of comparison. We basically do, we need the politics of analogy. It's not just analogy, but I think we have to go there.
Anthony.
Thank you, Dr. Love. I appreciate your... I'm going to quote you in honor of you being here.
Can you stand up, Anthony?
You quoting the Children's Hour. Shirley MacLaine. I feel so damn sick and dirty, I can't stand it.
Okay.
My question has more to do with your claim about the misconnection.
Yeah.
And I didn't hear you precisely articulate it, and I think you are saying it, that Gail Rubin did not miss the connection, but I didn't hear Goffman arise in thinking sex or trafficking women or anywhere that she, I know she, anthropology and everything, but how about Gail Rubin and
Goffman?
Erving Goffman? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Wow, this is like really right up my alley here with everything. Well, one of the things that kind of helped me to trace this, very sketchy genealogy that I kind of ran through pretty quickly was actually an argument that, because I did this conference called Rethinking Sex that was around Gail Rubin and was actually around the essay Thinking Sex, trying to get people to think about what's the utility of that essay and that model today. And it was a lot of other things, but that was kind of the spark of the conference. And then I did a journal issue, special issue of GLQ on Gail Rubin and on the Barnard Conference and on the essay. And the people who really had kind of deeply engaged with Thinking Sex and its kind of utility in the present, those are there's these short essays that are in there. So Steve Epstein, who's now at Northwestern, had a really interesting kind of reading of Gail's work that basically said she was so steeped in this history of kind of Chicago school sociology and deviance studies that is basically where the charmed circle is coming out. It's a kind of condensation of that research, or kind of refining into a kind of graphic model of that research. So all credit to Steve Epstein about making that connection. Specifically about Goffman, it's not exactly one of her people, and I think that's partly because Rubin is in a sense, a more materialist critic than I am, and so she's really interested in the sexuality studies research that happened, right? And like, why does Foucault get credited with social construction theory when we have Jeffrey Weeks publishing a couple years before that, basically making very similar claims. So she's interested in really work on sexual communities. Goffman didn't totally work on sexuality. He's also not materialist, i.e. and this is, because I'm basically like kind of a theorist and a literary critic, and what I'm really interested in about Goffman and another aspect of Goffman's method is the fact that most of his source materials, or a good deal of them, are literary. They're novels, they're case histories, they're autobiographies, they're memoirs. Some of them are anecdotes that he made up himself, little tiny little anecdotes, little scenes, social scenes that he imagines. And the history of presentation of self in everyday life is he was doing his PhD at Chicago, and he was supposed to go to the Shetland Islands and do this ethnography of these sheep farmers. And he got out there and he started, hanging out with the sheep farmers. He's like, forget this, I'm not doing this. And, it's cold and boring and whatever. And so he started hanging around the hotel restaurant. And a lot of the examples from presentation of self in everyday life are from restaurant work, front stage and backstage. It's like when you're dealing with the customers or when you're in the kitchen. And it basically was the kind of like departure from ethnography. And so, there's really something, it's not grounded in fact in a lot of ways, Goffman's work. It's quite literary himself. And so I think he's not one of Rubin's big examples, but Stigma, with the way it, according to Epstein, kind of, Stigma is a kind of example of deviant studies, and that makes its way into Rubin's work. So it's not as direct of a connection as some of these other ones. Is that?
Yeah.
Is that okay? Yeah.
I also noted that Eve Sedgwick deals with Goffman.
And that's how I got into Goffman, actually. I mean, I've read Presentation of Self, because it is actually read a lot in performance studies and theater studies, but for me it was this moment in Sedgwick's essays on Henry James' New York prefaces, kind of the beginning of the gay shame stuff, at least for me, which was really big for me, where she said that queer studies could just be called The Management of Spoiled Identity. The subtitle to Goffman's 1963 book, Stigma, it could be called The Management of Spoiled Identity, or she says, just Spoiled Identity. And I was like, yes, that's going to be amazing. That's going to be the title that I'm going to give queer studies, would be Spoiled Identity. I used Goffman a little bit in my first book, but I just kind of, the more I read of him, the more I just became obsessed with him. And I think that Sedgwick's interest in like Sylvan Tompkins, her going back to this kind of figure from the 60s, is also kind of like helped me think about why it might be useful for me to like dwell with Goffman and with this whole period at such kind of excruciating length, which is what I've been doing for the last several years. So, yeah.
Thank you.
So I'm still kind of chewing on that last coda, and so I have a question about what you gesture towards as a possible future direction in queer studies as stigma, and as that kind of realizing the promise of queer in terms of the shared marginality. But I wanted to, and that raises, I think it's really interesting, but it raises, as you mentioned, all these problems of comparison. How do you do that without flattening out difference? And one answer to that has been to do kind of deep genealogies. Let's do this deep genealogy of racialized histories versus kind of sexual identities, for instance.
Right.
So I'm wondering, in terms of method, how would a micro-sociological approach deal with these kind of differences? You know, how does Goffman deal with it? What are ways to do that other than maybe doing a kind of deep genealogy?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And you know, there's some stuff in here that I expect to be quite controversial. So this would be one of those points. So thank you for pointing that out. And I think the basic answer is that the whole arena of deep genealogies and actually exposing the reasons why things can't be compared in this like flattening way is super important, and it's something that this kind of approach can't get at all. Okay. Okay. It's really and so this is not like everything should just be microsociology from here on out. But I think that having a kind of that it's useful to have a kind of it's useful to have different approaches. I would say that, but it's also useful to have sort of counterexamples alongside different approaches, right? And I think this is an interesting kind of point of comparison for some of that kind of work, and with its kind of scrupulous avoidance of comparison, right? I mean, I'm probably, well, anyway, let me just say what I think the utility is and why I think how it could work in comparison. So what I was trying to suggest with this kind of description of Goffman's method is that it combines this deviant studies approach with the microsociology, and that's the combination that I find very useful. And basically what I would say is that I think that comparison, as problematic as it is in its like big claims about things being, gay is the new black or whatever, those kind of big claims which are patently false, I think comparison actually can work very, very well at the small scale. Okay? And these are the kind of comparisons that Goffman makes, right? So he'll pick these scenes, right? And they're scenes, and he talks about the small worlds of the interaction order. He's really talking about situations of co-presence. He's talking about a thing where you can see everybody and hear everybody, right? And of course, there's lots of interesting questions about that in the age of the internet and what that means and stuff, but that's kind of his world that he defines. And so the kind of similarities that he's tracing dynamics of stigmatization and strategies for responding to them, and he'll trace them at the level of sort of like gesture, right? And so he'll pick out these scenes and he'll notice that a similar kind of gesture, right, or a similar way of like entering the room, right? And if you have a discreditable identity, right, you're in a wheelchair, you're the only black person in a room of white people, all of these different discredited identities, you might use a similar strategy on coming into the room, announcing yourself, making a joke, diffusing the tension, whatever, right? And he gets really, really micro with this. So I have a reading of this little moment that's about a boy it's a kind of social psychology textbook example of a boy in a clinic, a sort of plastic surgery clinic, and he and this other boy are being treated for like congenital absence of an ear. And Goffman just excerpts this tiny little moment from that case history, right? There's all this stuff in the case history that's quite problematic, right, about who these boys are and stuff. And Goffman just focuses on this moment where the boy is sitting in the waiting room and he sees this other boy and just touches his, he's just looking at the other boy, the boy is touching his ear and he touches his ear too, right? So it's this kind of moment of solidarity that's that just stays at the level of the gesture, right? And I think that, at that micro scale, yeah, a lot of the sort of everyday life dynamics of stigmatization can be quite similar, right? And you can sort of bracket that, I think, in a certain way from other claims that you might want to make. And the strategies can be similar too. Okay, so it's a kind of bracketing. Now, I don't think that should be permanent, but I think there is an argument in Goffman to say that, and this is where I kind of get into Latour's work. Latour makes these arguments about we should have a sociology of the social. What is the social, right? That these kind of forces are immanent within interactions, right? Where, and again, it's going to be a very ahistorical, problematic view, but I think it's also in Foucault as well. Would be would give me a little bit more credibility maybe, right? But to say that it's really in the kind of infrastructural, kind of everyday life, that's where power is being enacted and that's where it's being reproduced. And so I think there is an argument to say, like, we can't make these grand comparisons, but if we kind of limit the scope and think about the micro, we can actually get at the dynamics. And, really, the point of all of my work is basically, like, there is homophobia. That's not like that great of an intervention, but I think it's like you have to continue to say it because it's one that slips out of view as a kind of structural force of inequality. And so I think this sort of focus on the micro, i.e. the way that, non-normative genders and sexualities continue to be discounted, second-class citizenship, hated, whatever, you can actually get that at that scale, and that we need to continue to keep that scale in focus.
Thanks.
Right.
Okay. We have time for maybe 2 more questions. Yes? You.
Maybe you kind of touched on this a little bit a second ago, but can you say a little bit more about what you said at the very end about how queer studies critiques on homonormativity can sort of block us from seeing certain types of violence?
Yeah. So I think homonormativity is a very useful concept. I teach it all the time. I think it's very important, right? And it's clearly something that's happening. I have a kind of, I can't necessarily prove this, but I would look at the sort of rhetoric of a lot of work pursuing that, trying to explain homonormativity or do those critiques. And I think what it tends to do rhetorically is to take a certain kind of, assimilated majoritarian gay and lesbian identity and make that stand in for a more general social reality, right? And that, I would just simply say, like, don't believe the hype, right? But I think often this work is being produced from sites that are quite like the site that I inhabit, i.e., I live in Philadelphia, my kids go to Quaker school, I'm like the president of the LGBT Family Association at their school, I'm paid to teach queer theory, I'm the faculty master with my girlfriend of our dorm. I live in a crazy world, right, that is like completely not representative of anything else that's going on, and it's quite unlike the situation in Kentucky where I grew up with and where I'm often visiting, right? Those kind of disjunctions and those kind of, that uneven landscape is very, very real to me. I feel that all the time, right? So that my kids can't even be like, think of any incidents of homophobia they've ever even experienced when under pressure. I'm like, come on guys, think of something, It's a very different world. But I think it's very important that, we not sort of take our quite partial view and sort of project that onto the rest of the world, because like life, homophobia again is a kind of structural force of oppression, just grinds on, right? And I think the kind of animus against a certain kind of like representative, but not truly actually representative figure of what's happening, just ignores the kind of like massive kind of ongoing forms of violence. And I think this is a general problem that I've always noted about the mismatch between the temporality of everyday social life and like professional criticism, right? Where we continue to like look for the new thing, and actually things are just the same, right? And so like if you look at like the work on like domestic violence in the 1970s and feminist work, it's just like this massive industry, and it's like, because this is clearly such an important problem. It remains to be an important problem, but people find it hard to like say a lot of new things about it. And so there's a real mismatch between like the work on it and the facts on the ground. And so I'm kind of trying to think about that, right? It's like, yeah, there is this new thing called homonormativity. There's also just like garden variety homophobia, and lots of people who can't be homonormative. Like most people don't have access to that kind of privilege and so on. So anyway, it's just that.
Lisa.
Thank you for a great talk. I'm a huge Goffman fan. I
Okay.
say talk more about Goffman. But and I teach him in disability studies, of course.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, though, you might know this. He's dropped out of
I
the
know.
disability studies reader.
Yeah.
And they kind of give this weird explanation, like other people are reading him, and so he's no longer. We don't. Almost like we don't need to go back and read him ourselves.
Yeah.
Which really pisses me off.
Yeah.
Because it's very foundational to disability studies.
Yeah.
But my sort of question, more like a comment, is about, one of his important concepts is this idea of mixed contacts, which he talks about in Stigma, which is basically what you were talking about, but these interactions, these micro interactions, but also that they're, these contacts are unequal in the sense that, so the stigmatized and the non-stigmatized come into contact with each other.
Yeah.
And in that moment, what he says that I think is really interesting, and I think it's, I'm asking whether it's connected to your ideas about method and the politics of method, is that in that moment of the mixed contact, it's the stigmatized that's reading the scene better, and is also sort of able, I mean, it's sort of a double consciousness idea, but is able also to analyze. Yeah. And so is in some ways doing some kind of analysis that the non-stigmatized isn't doing. And what he says that's always so kind of, I think is one of the most sort of tender points he makes is, of course, the stigmatized make the non-stigmatized more comfortable in those moments. That's their job. They know how, they have moments all the time, so they know how to do this. But it's also, there's something about what they're analyzing and their capacity to analyze. And so I wondered if you kind of thought about that in relation to method and the politics of method.
Yeah, and I mean, thank you, this is a great comment, and I often start talks actually by talking about that fact of him being in the first 3 editions of Disability Studies Reader and then dropping out, to think about his kind of strange status, right? Goffman talks about everything that we talk about, right, and he kind of should be, and in fact, some of this work is going to come out in this Duke book this summer called Theory Aside, where they asked us to pick a figure and say, like, how would a field look differently if somebody else had been central to it? So it was like, what if it was Goffman, right? And, why not, in a sense, right? He talks about institutions, power, stigma, all this stuff. But he talks about them the wrong way, right? And so it's not only that he's kind of, using outdated language of deviant studies, but also that, it seems suspect, right? And Butler basically indicates that he's kind of reproducing gender hierarchy. And so, and this is one of the big cruxes, the interpretive cruxes with Stigma. Like when you read Stigma or when you teach Stigma, it's very interesting because it starts off, and famously, Goffman is like, okay, there's these people, they're stigmatized, and we normals, right? He uses this phrase, we normals, and everybody's like, WTF? Like, why are you reading this? This sucks, but I've become very interested in Goffman as somebody who...
My students always rip that apart. They're like right on that so quick. Right. They're like, whoa!
Yeah, and so the punchline is that basically by the end of the book, that we normals has fallen apart, right? And been, not fallen apart, but been deconstructed by Goffman, right? So he has this there's this really famous part toward the end where he says, there's only one unblushing male in America, right? Youthful, fully employed, white, married, children, waspy, with a recent record in sports, right? I.e., it's a kind of, there's no norm, right? There's an empty, there are no normals, right? There's no we. So the question of like Goffman's position and his viewpoint is very interesting. And of course, people often ask me when I'm talking about, when I give a talk more that's like about Goffman, they're like, was he stigmatized? And I was like, well, he's really short. He's he's Jewish, right? He's from Canada, from this small town in Canada, whatever. I'm like, okay, there's a case to be made or whatever. But the point is, I think that the sort of self-reflexivity and the thinking about the point of view of the observer is to me very powerful, and it's been very powerful for me as a kind of critical or sort of self-critical thing for me to think about. Like I always think about this as like very much a post-tenure book because I think it's also about the sort of conditions of scholarship, and it's actually a much more uncomfortable case to think about the way that we observe social outsiders. I used to think I was one. Now I feel like really I'm like a tenured professor, and that's not really a marginal position. So the kind of subject position out of which I wrote Feeling Backward, a kind of identificatory position, doesn't feel actually right to me now. And so I'm interested in Goffman as somebody who was really thinking about and unsentimentally, I guess, about the sort of position of the scholar and the how complicit the scholar is in producing and re-stigmatizing the people that he or she studies. And so that's all kind of going into it for me. But really, what you're saying is that who's the position of the observational approach. The total master of the observational approach is the stigmatized person who has to read the scene, right? And so we have all of these great points, arguments about that marginalized people can see more, double consciousness,
and their senses are sharper too.
Yeah, so it's or Cumbie River Collective, right? It's like from this position we can see more, right? The privilege of knowing, all that stuff, right? But I think what Goffman gives us is an account of a kind of observational surplus, right? That basically to be stigmatized is to be a microsociologist, right? It's to be able to read scenes in this way with a kind of hypersensitivity that is in itself an analysis of the operations of power, right? At that small scale. So.
Well, that's wonderful. So let's thank Dr. Love one more time, and please come into the